Hello, and welcome to the first session in our extended reality lecture series, where we will talk about reality virtuality continuum. Before we explore this topic further, we will take a look at this photo, which was called the image that broke the internet in 2015. The main reason is that people could not agree what the color of this dress was. In order to answer this question, there was a survey conducted as part of this research, which you can see on the bottom line. And 57% of the people specified that they can see black and blue colors, while 30% said that they can see white and gold as the two main colors. Actually, the color of the dress, when you see it in this image, is blue and brown, which only 11% of the people saw. So why did this occur? Let's take a look at another example before we answer this question. So we have this Rubik's Cube, which has a 5x5 grid or array of squares on each side. And if we take a look only at the middle square of the top side and the front side, we have to compare these two colors. So the question here is the color of the middle square on the top side the same as the color of the middle square on the front side? When you take a look at it like this, you can say probably that it's not. But if I take out the context, you can see that they actually are. So there is no image manipulation in this case. As I'm going back and forth here, you can take a look that the colors are the same. So what is going on here? Do we only have optical illusions, or is there something more happening here? Since a more complex topic is the dress photo, we will address it here. So the dress is actually blue and black, and you can see that it's blue and black, but you can also see that it's gold and white in this photo. So what happened? You have an overexposed image, which is reflecting more light in the area where it's being overexposed, and the part that's actually showing the real color of the dress is adequately exposed. But why do people perceive the dress to be one or the other? So the part that's the same for each of us is the sensation part. So the color or the light entering our eye and reaching the receptors in the eye and activating them or creating impulses, but those impulses are being processed by the brain. And this part is the one that's causing the problem, the perception part. So if we call the sensation part top one, the perception part is the bottom one, which causes the issue. So when we take a look at the dress, we have some who consider the dress to be white and gold, but only some parts are in the shadow, which is why it is perceived as blue and black. Other people consider it blue and black, but in some cases there is light hitting it, which is actually revealing the reflected light, which is why it's white and gold. You can best see it in this picture where you have both type of the dresses, but when you put something in shadow and the other one in the light, it's basically the same color. So the context and the perception of our brain makes the entire difference. So with this image, we can understand that there are different perceptions of objective things that exist around us, and that the reality is more or closer to being subjective than being objective. However, we have to place reality in the context of virtuality in this case, because we are exploring the entire continuum between these two things. So what is real and what is virtual, and where we can fit in so we can explore this topic. So the foundation for extended reality occurred or were set in 1994 in this paper by Milgram and Kishino, where they talked about a taxonomy of mixed reality visual displays. It looks something like this, where a lot of topics you might be familiar with. So you have augmented reality, which you probably heard of, but the augmented virtuality part is perhaps something that isn't so clear. Virtual environment has strong ties with virtual reality, while mixed reality is something probably in between if we take a look at it from this stance. And then there is extended reality as something that has been introduced since. So in order to explore all these topics, we have to figure out how to say something is augmented reality, something is augmented virtuality. So the main thing how to do that is if we introduce criteria, certain criteria according to which we can discern what is what. And in this case, the criteria is the virtual content. So the virtual content, according to the paper we just discussed, introduces topics such as real and virtual objects, direct and indirect viewing, and real and virtual images. And those three things are very important in order to grasp the entire extended reality or reality virtuality continuum. So in this image here, we can take a look at this person who is directly viewing at something that's a real object, and it's being sampled and creating a virtual objects, and then you have real images and virtual images. When you understand the basic definitions of what each of this is, this image makes a lot of sense. In this case, it can have different interpretations. So we will try to answer or put forth definitions for all of these things, so this image makes more sense when you come back to it later. So when we are talking about real and virtual objects, we're actually talking about the difference of real objects having matter or substance or something that proves their objective existence as is described in the paper. That means that it has to have physical or objective, something that exists without us believing in it. While virtual objects are described as something only having the effect that exists. So they exist in essence or effect, but not formally or actually, as is described in their paper. So if we take a look at this image here, and we talk about if something is real or virtual, or if this is a real or a virtual object, it can become difficult to discern since this is a photogrammetric model of a real 3D space, which is shown to us as a dense point cloud, and hence a lot of things can be left unsaid if we just have to discern if this is a real or a virtual object at this moment, because we have to introduce if this is being viewed through our eyes or if this is being viewed through a display medium such as a phone or a monitor or a head-mounted display or something like that. So in this case, if this is being viewed through a monitor or through a screen, then we can say that this is definitely a virtual object because it had to be synthesized somewhere and shown here, while the real object exists as it has physical matter. So in this case, this is a virtual object, even though it's being made out from a real object that really exists. So that distinction needs to be made, which is why we need to introduce this direct and indirect viewing of these real and virtual objects. So direct viewing would then be described as something that you are looking directly at through air or through glass, which was defined in this paper. So direct viewing is when you can observe it directly through air or through glass, while the indirect viewing has to do with looking through certain media, as we've discussed now. So it says that the non-direct viewing of real object relies on the use of some imaging system, first to sample data, for example, video camera, laser, or ultrasound scanner, and then to resynthesize or reconstruct these data via some display medium. So if we take a look at this image, for example, this is now a 360 view of a house that's on the market or something. And if we take a look at it right now, we can say that this is definitely indirect viewing because we are using a screen that's being in front of us in form of a head-mounted display or on a monitor. So that means that we do not have a real connection through air or through glass in order to take a look at this. So that means that we now have to talk about if something is a real image or a virtual image that we are perceiving. And hence we need to answer these questions. If something is a real image or a virtual image. As is described in the research paper, a real image is any image which has some luminosity at the location at which it appears to be located. That means that if you are watching something, it has certain light that's being projected to your eye. That's the real image part. The virtual image, on the other hand, is something that doesn't have luminosity at the location in which it appears and only includes examples such as holograms and mirror images. So it also includes stereoscopic display, which means that you can take a look at two real images with each eye and then create a virtual image in your head, which is 3D. That's also something that's important to discuss here. So a real image is an image you see on a display or in a monitor or a head-mounted display or whatever. A virtual image is something you create in your head, or it's a hologram. So something that doesn't have luminosity at the origin point or the location at which it appears. So in this case, we have a image, a real image on the phone, which means it has luminosity there. And then that image is being projected and reflected to us, which means this is a form of a hologram. However, in this case, it's not that obvious because there is a laminar flow here of air where the projector is projecting an image. And since there is no luminosity at the location where we think this image is, that is a virtual image in this case, by definition, which we saw. So at this point, we've discussed the real virtual object, direct, indirect viewing, and real and virtual images, but we have taken a look through the reality scope of it. So how do we, from real world, describe this? However, in the reality virtuality continuum, we have to take a look at the virtual part as well, and then take a look how we can discuss these topics from the virtual point of view. The first part, the real versus virtual object, is the extent of world knowledge. That means that when you take a look at how the reality virtuality continuum is interpreted through the extent of world knowledge, it only means that we are taking a look at what is modeled and portrayed to us. So on one side, we have a world that is totally unmodeled, which means that whatever we are viewing, either direct viewing or real or virtual image viewing, we have no modeled or virtual elements that we can see. On the other hand, on the other side, we have a world which is completely modeled, and in this case, it can be the virtual reality part. So everything is modeled. However, we have these parts in between where it says where what and where plus what, which has to do with augmented reality, augmented virtuality, and all the things of mixed reality in between. This basically means that if you have something which is either wireframe or completely shaded, it doesn't matter. It's only taking a look at what is modeled and what knowledge you are getting from it. So you cannot just look at the amount of pixels that are modeled and the amount of pixels that are real and then make a jump to what you have. So in this case, they are introducing a criteria of, do you know where this virtual object is in the real world, or do you know what it is? If you know both, you are more leaning towards the world which is completely modeled. And if you don't have that info, you are leaning more towards the world that's unmodeled. So in the extent of world knowledge, we are taking a look at the amount of modeled virtual objects which we are putting onto the real display. And if we have information about where the object is or what it is, so if we are getting an information that this is a car, this is a tree, and this is located there and there in our GPS or in some street, then we are getting more information from it, and we are extending our world knowledge in this case. So when we are talking about the direct and indirect viewing, we are basically talking about the reproduction fidelity. So what is the value and what is the quality of the images we are getting, but not from the stance of the pixels that we have, but from the stance of what the image actually is. Is it just simple wireframes, or is it shaded? Does it have surfaces, or does it have textures and something that's traced, which means it has a higher fidelity and photorealistic appearance, and so on. So in this case, if we create a photorealistic room, we are more likely to engage our users or the people who view it, because that's something they have grown accustomed to, as opposed to something which has flat shading or wireframe, which is more stylized and something that people can perhaps use in augmented reality more than when we are viewing it in the virtual reality scope of it. So finally, we talk about the real versus virtual image, which is something that's called the extent of presence metaphor. That means that we are talking about the feel of being present in the space we are observing through these images, regardless of their reproduction fidelity. And then we are talking about the output devices, such as monitors, large screens, head-mounted displays, and so on. So if we are looking at something that's modeled, in this case, this person has a head-mounted display, which can be a Microsoft HoloLens, or it can be a head-mounted display. But if he is seeing images, or this person is seeing images, real images for both of his eyes, we are getting a virtual image in our head, and we are feeling like we are being present in that space more. So with these three things, like the extent of world knowledge and the reproduction fidelity and the extent of presence metaphor, we can take a look at the sense of presence which oscillates around these three poles. So we have the physical environment where we are, but we are carrying a head-mounted display which is showing us images. So through these images, we are creating virtual environments in our head. And that thing goes around and around in order to make us feel like we are present in that space. So once we have taken a look at how the real or the reality part of this reality virtuality continuum is discussed, and we have taken a look at the virtual part, now we can talk about it from our own standpoint, which means that the extent of world knowledge is nothing more than just talking about modeling. And the reproduction fidelity and the extent of presence make us feel like we are in that space, which is called immersion. So when we have the modeling and the immersion, is this enough in order for us to create and fully explore the extended reality scope or reality virtuality continuum? It's very important to introduce the interaction as also one of the criteria, which is an important factor when we have to discuss where we are on the reality virtuality continuum. So if we have a modeling, for example, as just being one of the criteria, then we can say, okay, in this case, this is the real world, and this is augmented reality, this is something in between, this is augmented virtuality, and this is fully virtual reality. So we just have one line and we can choose where we want it to be. However, if we go to two criteria like immersion as well as modeling, then we have this entire grid where we have to think where the augmented reality, augmented virtuality, virtual reality is, and so on. So is it along one of the axes? Is it far away from the axis? Does it have to be both for them? So does this mean that this is real world and this is augmented reality, something in between augmented virtuality, and this is virtual reality? So is this true? And what if you introduce more criteria like interaction part? That means that you have this whole space which can be filled with where you have to decide which cube specifies which parts of the reality virtuality continuum. So when we take a look at this based on these criteria, now we have to define each of the topics. So in the real environment, we are talking about having zero modeled elements and having full immersion, because all our senses are telling us that we are there and we have full interaction capabilities. But what if we want to discuss getting out of this real environment? So you put, for example, noise canceling headphones, and you are in a real world environment. Your immersion is in this case lowered. So is this still real world environment, or are you somehow moving forward to the virtual continuum? So the real question is, are you going basically away from the real environment, or are you entering the virtual reality in this case? The same thing goes for transparency mode in headphones, where you can hear more from your surrounding than you would without the headphones. So is that something that gets more immersion out of your presence? The same thing goes when you try a food that you tried when you were, for example, a child. It immediately transports you there, which means that the immersion part is elevated or higher than it would have been when you were just being in the restaurant and not and tasting the food. So the augmented reality part then has to have a certain amount of model parts, but is immersion and interaction an important aspect here? So if we take a look at this, we have, for example, our phone, and we are taking a look at a real world environment, and we are getting information as to what something is and where something is. So we are getting directions to where we should go and what something is around us. So we're getting extra information, like the extent of world knowledge is enlarged in this case. We have some modeled elements with texts and directions. The immersion is not that high because when we view at this image, when we look at this image, we don't believe that we are there, neither do we have to. This is just an augmented reality app. It's giving us more information, but we have zero interaction with this augmented reality part. However, in this case, there is a certain amount of interaction because you can click on some buttons and get the extra information you would like, or you can put your hand in front of the screen and then show or move something to have a much larger interaction effect. And then the immersion as well, because you feel as if you are moving something there. The amount of model parts is basically the same. So the basically only difference here is in the interaction. When we are talking about the augmented virtuality part, that's inverted. So if you in augmented reality have modeled parts which are in lesser amount than the real world elements, in this case, it's flipped. So you have a lot of virtual elements and a very small amount of real world elements. So for example, if you are using a virtual reality headset and you mask the view with something that goes around your hands, so only your hands are visible from the real world and everything else is virtual reality, that means that you have augmented virtuality. So you are augmenting your experience in the virtual world with real elements, as you can see here. That also goes for green screens, as we can see here. So when you have a person which is real and you put them on a green screen which has virtual elements, you are basically having an augmented virtuality experience. However, in this case, people who are playing this have a head-mounted display on them and have a fully virtual reality experience because they don't have a green screen or can see their hands in this case. This example here showcases another photogrammetric model of the real world, and then the question is posed, is this augmented virtuality? So this wasn't modeled, it was synthesized from real objects. So this is a virtual object, as we have discussed previously. It's being viewed indirectly since we are looking at it from a screen, and this is a virtual image if we have a head-mounted display, or it's a real image if we are looking at it through a screen. However, if we have to decide if this is augmented virtuality, it's very tricky to answer because it probably would be just fully virtual environment if we put head-mounted display on. But if we take a look at it from a phone, it will just be a regular image like a 360 view. So where is the boundary drawn? That's something to explore for further notices. Now, when we are talking about the mixed reality part, usually people describe it as something, or there are different ways of describing it, but the most common one is when you use mixed reality, you describe something that includes the interaction portion into it. So mixed reality is not just an umbrella term that covers everything from real environment to the virtual environment, so everything in between, like augmented reality and augmented virtuality. It is also something that includes interaction. And then extended reality is basically the umbrella term that takes all of these things into consideration with or without interaction in this case. So with this, we have discussed the basic terminology regarding the reality virtuality continuum, how we can describe each of these things, that it's not definite. It can be objectively described since it has different criteria which we introduce and which help us describe what we need for certain events or certain applications within our work. So when we have to talk about where it lies in this scope, it's like a blob. It's just going without any boundaries, because you have to introduce larger or smaller amounts of modeling, immersion, and interaction in order to get how this is going. We can take a look at this example. So if you haven't heard yet, this is a presentation for Microsoft HoloLens. What we are seeing is what this person is seeing as well. So we have glasses, which showcase virtual elements. This is something that we see, but we also see the real world around us. So by definition, this would be augmented reality. So you have virtual elements and you have real world elements, which are more than virtual elements. However, you have a very large amount of interaction. So you can move everything because Microsoft HoloLens recognizes your hands as well. And whatever you do, it's being tracked in real world. So the immersion part is also elevated. So in this case, if we wanted to place it somewhere, we can just say, oh yeah, it has a smaller amount, for example, of modeled elements. The immersion is high, but not that high, but the interaction is very high. So it would be probably somewhere in this portion. So is this now mixed reality because it uses interaction, for example? And if this is true, then that's based on the criteria we introduced. However, if we just want to look at the virtual content, then we can say, okay, this is augmented reality because there is less virtual elements than there are real elements, or what we are looking at. So with this, we can draw a end of this session and introduce the next session and the topic that we will cover in the next part, which has to do with the interaction part, or something that is connected to our human-computer interaction portion. So how do we as people connect to all of this, which we have discussed now, each of these extended reality or reality virtuality continuum? So where we will talk about the interaction part and how it connects to the extended reality or the reality virtuality continuum, and each of these definitions or scopes that exist within them. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next lesson.